good. I hope the previous one actually worked now that I think about it. My channel. Okay. Live. Oh, yep, there's my voice. Okay. Nope, that's not going to show up. Okay. Alrighty. Let's get back into Egypt, which has only got a little bit left. So, actually, I'm going to pop back to this just for a second. So we had the Middle Kingdom with the weaker royal power. More people could be mummified, and the Semitic Hyksos invaded and stuck around for about 150 years before finally being driven out, which then led to, let's see, the New Kingdom. So this began under Amenhotep the Fourth. Again, this is on page 23 for anybody that got their hands on the book. But again, if you can't, I understand. And he did something a little bit different. He decided to attempt to create a monotheistic regime or religion in Egypt. And considering the amount of gods and spirits and whatnot they had in Egypt, that caused a lot of trouble. There was upheaval, tributaries, which are kingdoms and lands and territories that aren't directly controlled by Egypt, but offer tribute to Egypt and are they're under the influence of Egypt, but not under direct control. They just up and left because they're like, hey, you're going to piss off all the other gods, and we're not going to be a part of that, so we're just leaving. By the 1250s, control was restored, and this began a series of military rulers. In particular, Ramses II, who was probably one of the more powerful rulers in Egypt. Again, pharaoh isn't really a proper term for Egyptian rulers. That was something made up later. And as I said before, Egyptians were typically polytheistic. One of the more prominent ones being Ra, the sun god, because, well, you need the sun. In a lot of old theologies, like, the sun was seen as like the most important god because you need the sun to do pretty much anything, especially when it came to farming societies, and most old societies were farming societies. So, what are you going to do? Yes, here we are. So, as I mentioned, especially in the earlier days, the rulers are often seen as divine, and therefore they control the Nile, and the Nile flooding was important for the agricultural cycle. But once again, if a human, if the person that you can physically go and see is the one that's in charge of the Nile doing the proper flooding, and the Nile hasn't properly flooded, you can take a grievance to this guy, and it's his fault if you've got a famine. And some rulers ended up not lasting too long because of this. So it's quite dangerous. Also, there were a number of female rulers. Hatshepsut, page 24, is one such ruler. And while this wasn't the norm, it wasn't like it wasn't really a big deal. It was just like, okay, well, the ruler is a lady. Okay. Like there wasn't they didn't have a different like title for it wasn't like, oh, well, this is the queen regent until the son becomes of age and then he takes over. Like she was in charge. In fact, there's a particular statue where she's wearing the big fake beard, the big like chin beard that was often depicted on a lot of these rulers. That it was representative of like a crown. Like it was fake on all the dudes too. Like it was just a thing they stuck on their chin as like part of the outfit. Also on page 25, there's this mention of Egypt as seen from the outside. Let's see. Near Eastern rulers from the kingdoms of Babylonia, Mitannia, and Assyria wrote to Egyptian kings offering their deep respect and seeking favors, gold, military support, protection from Egyptian mistreatment, etc., etc. Offered loyalty, service, and gifts. So yeah, clearly Egypt had a lot of power, and outside kingdoms were, offering them the stuff in exchange for, essentially favors. One sequence of the letters, the Egyptian king that a certain lion-like, in Palestine was threatening to seize the city of Megiddo, south of Tyre, to compromise Egyptian interests. Wrote to the king to defend himself, accusing his accusers of undermining him and Egypt's interest. Let's see. Suggests Egypt's power and influence, extensive wealth and military strength. So yeah, even beyond Egypt's borders, other nations were asking Egypt to intercede. So yeah, Egypt was quite powerful. That said, it often says here that Egypt often didn't intercede with outside powers because they were busy trying to keep themselves from inwardly collapsing. Because, we saw from the Old Kingdom that they were already having internal issues. Speaking of Ra, it's a movie that just gets older every time I post it, but don't worry about it. Yeah, there's Ra, the sun. The idea being that he carries the sun in his chariot across the sky each day. There's Hatshepsut. So, moving out of Egypt and into the rest of the region. Now, I know, again, we literally talked last time about how the Bronze Age and Iron Age stuff isn't real specific, but we're still going to use them as a broad idea of when people were using tools, because that still works. So iron replacing bronze as tools and weapons. So we don't know a lot about the Minoans. They lived on the island of Crete. They did a lot of trade in the Mediterranean, and again, Crete being right in the middle of the Mediterranean certainly helped out. They depicted bulls in their art quite a bit. I'll show you an image of that in a little bit. They used a linear A-B writing, which if I was going into more like specific writing styles, I go into that more, but don't worry too much about that. Sorry, my head is killing me. And between 1400 and 1350 BCE, they just kind of disappeared. There's theories as to what happened, but we're not entirely sure. Then we have the Mycenaean Greeks, which were, well, before runners of the Greek city-states, but they were, well, again, I'll get into it more in a little bit. I keep getting ahead of myself. Said these big, heavily fortified settlements, they fought all the time. I mean, that's all they did. They actually didn't have any form of trade. They didn't have any form of agriculture. They didn't do any kind of mining. They just fought and took what they needed. They were basically just raiders. They were actually influenced by Minoan writing, so they took ideas from Minoa, and they actually arrived in Crete to try to like conquer it, but when they got there, the Minoans were already gone. That's why we say that the Minoans just kind of disappeared, because like we have evidence of the Minoans living there, and then we have evidence of these like violent warrior Greeks living there, but there's no evidence of any kind of fighting or like destruction. It's just the Mycenaean Greeks show up, and it's like they showed up and there was nobody there. It's really weird. So here's some of the bull art from Crete. This idea of like vaulting over the bull. There's theories as to what that means. Like maybe it's some sort of ritualistic thing. Why is that all the way? Okay. Weird. These are what the Mycenaean cities look like. They were just, again, big fortified cities. Oftentimes, the Greek cities that came later were just built on top of them. Much like how in Italy today, I mean, you can see it on the news all the time, but especially now with me having friends that are Italian, they just live in Italy. Wow, that's a terrible typo there. I didn't write that. It's not my fault. But yeah, they're just like, oh yeah, this dude was digging in his backyard and ran into like an ancient Roman bathhouse. Like, living in Italy, you can't do anything. But yeah, sort of same idea here. Is like you're in Greece, okay? You're in Greece, you just build on top of stuff. So you go in your backyard and dig, and you hit like the ruins of something from thousands of years ago. All right. So again, continuing on with the Mycenaeans, as I said, they did war. I misspoke. They did also trade, but they didn't have any kind of agriculture. Like, they didn't grow their own stuff. They either took it or they traded for it. And this was the time of the Trojan War. And what's interesting about this, we don't actually have any historical records about the Trojan War. We don't have any like eyewitness records or like generals or anybody writing about it. We have Homer's Iliad, which means Trojan War. Which is like a heroic tale of this war that happened in the past. And for a while, historians didn't believe it was an actual war because he also wrote, the Odyssey, which is clearly a fantasy story. Because, I mean, the dude fought, like, sirens and Cyclopes, I guess is the plural, and all sorts of stuff. So, like, well, maybe this war didn't happen. And then I think some German archaeologists used the Iliad to try to track down where this stuff would have happened and did some digging. And it was like, oh, hey, there's a city here. And based on the archaeology, these cities existed. So we're pretty sure the Trojan War happened, like just based on archaeology. Now, granted, again, the Iliad is not a historic document because it's still technically like a fictional retelling of a thing that almost definitely happened based on the archaeological evidence we have. But this is the only writing we have of it, which is kind of interesting, which I'll get into in a minute as to why that's the only writing we have of it. So this was around 1200 BCE. We also have the Hittites. Showed up in Anatolia around this time as well, or 2000 BCE. And they were the first to start using iron. So they were ahead of the curve on that. Iron, again, being stronger and lighter than bronze. And if you're using bronze armor and a dude comes at you with an iron sword, you're not in good shape. I actually misspoke last time. I said it took 100 years. It took 1,000 years for this stuff to spread. Now, I put this under Hittites just because there ain't anywhere else to put it. They are not necessarily Hittites. There's a group called the Sea People that we don't really know anything about. They showed up, they raided like every group we've talked about so far, and many of these empires were crippled and fell into ruin, and then the Sea People just kind of disappeared. And that was it. They just showed up out of nowhere, burned stuff to the ground, and left. I somehow found myself on a really stupid Facebook group called We Pretend It's the Bronze Age Internet. And so people post like images of stuff from the Bronze Age and talk like it's the Bronze Age, but somehow we have internet access. And anytime somebody says something objectionable, they're like, oh, that sounds like Sea People propaganda to me. It's weird, but it's very amusing. And like one of the group rules is basically it's like, don't be racist, just call people Sea People. Like if you're gonna try to be rude about something, just like that's the catch-all term. So another major important group here is the Phoenicians. They were known as the Purple People due to a dye that they traded that was made from sea snails, and I assume we all know why purple is an important dye.
It's very hard to make and very expensive.
Yes, but why was it important? Yes, nobility used it. And therefore it had a high demand. Or rather, the people that wanted it would pay a lot. And the Phoenicians became this great trading empire throughout the Mediterranean. I mean, they basically controlled the Mediterranean for a long period of time. They adapted this Semitic alphabet. But this weird thing about the Phoenician alphabet is, well, I'll say weird thing. This important thing about the Phoenician alphabet is they used letters for sounds, which hadn't been a thing yet. So super important that they actually had letters for sounds rather than like symbol or, pictures and like this symbol means man and this symbol means ox. It's like, no, here's like the letter for M. However, they only had consonants. Vowels were just kind of understood. Like if you were to write man, which it wouldn't be M-A-N, because again it's Phoenician, but the example would be like M-N, and you would just sort of assume it meant man, probably also due to the context of the sentence. So there weren't vowels yet. That comes later. But this is extremely important. And at least I remember this from my childhood. Like when you're first learning to read, you're learning your phonics, like sounding stuff out. That's actually where we got that word from, the Phoenicians. Phonics, P-H-O-N-I-C-S. So yeah, the Phoenicians were super important. I mean, again, they're known for the purple dye and being like a major trading group, but also their alphabet is used by other groups that end up essentially running the world for a while. So this is super important for basically the rest of history. So that's good. Here is a probably not accurate depiction of the Trojan horse. Imagine it was nowhere near that ornate. So here we have, under Ramses II, the extent of Egypt. So it wasn't just down here. They actually were way up the Mediterranean coast. They also had the Hittite Empire, which was essentially Mesopotamia now. I mean, they had all of this up here. Or no, Mesopotamia is down here. That's what, modern-day Turkey? Yeah, we'll actually get into that later as well. And then, of course, there were all these smaller groups here and there. And up here is Greece, which will be our next stop. Oh, yeah, there's Troy, by the way, in case you were wondering where Troy was. Troy is way out this way. And again, let me just pull back real quick. So here's Egypt. Again, one of the most powerful empires at the time. Here's the Hittite Empire, which was also very powerful. Mesopotamia is over this way. Where is... Well, I guess it doesn't really matter. Here is Phoenicia. All along here, and here is their travel and their empire. They set up here in Carthage, Cyrene. What's that? Lesbos? Yeah. Tangier, Sardinia. They were all over the Mediterranean. Now, they didn't have like a single, like, again, Egypt had a bunch of land all in one area. The Hittite Empire had a bunch of land all in one area. But they had basically the entire Mediterranean Sea. Now, this is where things get interesting. Well, by chapter like 4 and 5, when we get into Rome. Phoenicia, Tyre being like one of their main cities, they eventually get taken over by the growing Persian Empire. They get taken over. But their cities out here, especially Carthage, they remain independent and they become their own empire. So while their original empire falls, these major cities out here remain independent and powerful because of how spread out the Phoenician Empire was. It's real impressive. Oh, also here's the shell of that sea snail. I mean, you can tell they just would crush it up and strain it and get that dye. Okay, and we can't talk about the ancient Middle East without talking about the rise of the Hebrews. Culturally, they still exist. Due to a binding religion and tradition of oppression, because boy, they've had a hard time. We're gonna constantly come back to the Jews. It's like, hey, so there's stuff going on, and by the way, they were oppressing the Jews while they were there. Yeah, it's not good shape. So, hold on. Okay, yeah. So Judaism is known as being monotheistic, but it didn't start that way. Judaism comes out of Canaanite religion of many gods, polytheism, and it evolved into what is known as henotheism, which is this idea of there being other gods, but they're lesser gods, and then we have our God that's on top, which, being Yahweh, which is why the verbiage of the first commandment is to not have any other gods before me, not I am the only God, period. Now that does eventually evolve into there is just the one God and you're not supposed to recognize that any exists at all. But initially there was this whole pantheon, and the Hebrews chose their champion that they went with, and that's where that all spun off from. So it began with Abraham departing Ur. 40 years of captivity to receive Mesopotamia, all of that. Also, the whole, I'll get that in a second. There's the tale of Moses in Egypt. There is no evidence of the Jews being enslaved in Egypt. In fact, there's no evidence of slaves being used as labor in Egypt. They paid the farmers to build the pyramids. In fact, the pyramids were completed long before this ever happened. Just FYI. Yeah, because the farmers would do their stuff with the Nile, and then once all that irrigation was done, they'd get paid to go work on the pyramids. So Joshua invaded Canaan. lots of fun genocide happened. The tribes of Egypt were politically diverse. There was lots of infighting. Like Israel itself was split into like two main regions, Israel and Judah, and they fought, and it was a whole thing forever. Yeah, so see, there's Canaan, and they left from Mesopotamia, and then also the thing of like Moses leaving from Egypt but traveling for 40 years in the desert. It's like it doesn't take 40 years to go through the desert. Like he would have had to go through all of Africa to have taken 40 years. But again, we will come back to these folks because again, they stick around as much as everybody tends to give them a hard time. All right. All right, let's move on to chapter 2. Any questions before we continue? Oops. Any questions before we continue? Okay. There we go. Why does it keep bringing me to 102? All right. So again, chapter 1, I will put up on Blackboard. I'll put the PowerPoint up on Blackboard. Unless I already did that. I don't remember if I already did that. I'll do it today. So that'll all be up there. And once we get close to end of chapter 2, I'll do that as well. So, chapter 2 is called Many Greases. And let me tell you, autocorrect does not, or spell check does not like Greece being pluralized. But it makes sense to some degree because there was no unified Greece until like the 1800s. Greece existed as multiple city-states, and especially in this period, in this section, there are multiple city-states. Each city is its own politically, culturally, economically, agriculturally, just diverse in such unique ways that it's hard to even imagine that they're at all the same. Heck, some places barely speak the same language. So let's start with how the chapter starts with Hesiod, or not Hesiod, Herodotus. Where did I go to Hesiod? Herodotus. He's called the father of history, but also the father of lies. He's not really either. At the time, and again, this kind of goes back to Homer, which we'll get into Homer in greater detail here because we're talking about Greece. When you wrote about stuff, in particular like explorations or especially foreign lands, you weren't just telling them what you saw, you're supposed to also be entertaining them. So to exaggerate a little bit was kind of the point. So when he was telling Greeks about what he saw in, say, Northern Africa or in the Near East, he would exaggerate and go into, well, here we are, strange foreign customs, embellishing them to make things not quite true. but interesting. Oh, and I wouldn't say it was necessarily Hesiod that did it. I keep saying Hesiod. He comes up later. Herodotus. But it was these early explorations by the Greeks that actually created the idea of the Cyclops. Do any of you guys know where that actually came from? What physical thing they found in our world that made them think there was some giant humanoid with one eye? Let me see if I can. Well, let me finish this slide and then I'll get a picture. He championed Greek unity, and in particular the independence of each individual polis. A polis is another term for the Greek city-state, so we'll be using that term, by the way. Against the Persian Empire, even as the polis, that's the plural, were preparing to fight each other. And was also against unbridled imperialism, which is to say Athens. This is all for stuff at the end of the chapter. But he was largely ignored. And there's going to be a couple of Greek terms you guys are going to need to know by the end of, or by the time the test shows up. And then when we get to Rome, you guys are going to have to learn a little bit of Latin by the end of it. But, well, if you guys decide to take any biology, you're going to need to learn a lot of Latin anyway. Anyway, there's Herodotus in Vienna, in Austria. In peace, sons bury their fathers. In war, fathers bury their sons. Quite a few quotes here from these guys. Yeah, here's Herodotus. Call no man happy until he is dead. Okay. All right. Actually, before I bring up the next one, I'm going to show you guys that image real quick. Close that. And since I'm doing the online, I should probably change the display so they can see it as well. All right, do. It looks like it's got one big eye hole.
And what is it really an elephant?
It's an elephant skull, yeah.
So
That's where the trunk goes.
yeah, that really big eye hole is just where the trunk is.
Mm-hmm. Because see, the eyes are over
Yeah,
here.
they're on the side.
And they thought it was a giant?
Yeah. I mean, and it probably would have been more decayed than this, but like they're along northern Africa and they see this like big, I mean, it looks almost human. This big skull with this one big hole in the front, and they're like, holy crap. There's this.
That mouse with the big long nose. What is it called? The one with the big pointy nose, and it was scary looking.
Oh, that was for the plague, wasn't it? Like
Yeah,
the
like
The
a
mouse?
black-
The one, it's.
Oh,
Yeah.
the plague doctor mask.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what it looks like.
Yeah, so that's actually where, yeah, see, that's actually where the idea for the Cyclops came from, was an elephant skull, which is really neat. So yeah, just thought I would bring that up. I always like bringing that up in this class. Boop. All right, back to this. Oh, it's not. Whatever. Okay. See, as we're going to see in a little bit, or we're going to see towards the end of the chapter, which is going to be probably not even next week. Athens is going to get a little too big for us britches. But really just remember Hesiod was the one that was attempting to do some amount of history despite embellishing it. Something that we modern historians try to not do. All right. Oh. So back to, let me make sure that's actually working. Okay. Dang it. All right. So immediately following what we saw previously with like the sea people and the various groups collapsing, we have this period of history, these 300 years known as the Greek Dark Ages. And it's really depressing for historians because there's not a lot of, well, history. There's no writings from that period. There's not even much like archaeological evidence. There's not much pottery, not even a lot of building ruins. So like a lot of the buildings that I guess they were using at the time were wooden or, shoot, even thatch, stuff that we don't have much evidence of. So we don't know what happened. The Mycenaean age that we were just talking about was this heroic time of high culture and warfare, and we have evidence of their big cities and walls and grand armies. And after this, it's like they disappeared for 300. Well, I mean, they didn't disappear for 300 years, but it's just like we don't know what happened. For a couple of centuries there, we don't know. And that's why a lot of historians, I keep saying a lot of historians, that's why most historians refuse to use the Dark Ages when we talk about the medieval era, because there was still a lot of writing going on. It's just it was typically relegated to monasteries and stuff. It's just a lot of the population in Europe was illiterate. So there wasn't a lot of writing going on, and it was the Dark Ages for a lot of places. But it wasn't like this, where there was nothing. Gradually, cities began to resettle, but this wasn't the Mycenaean Age anymore. There wasn't much trade. They couldn't maintain the war economy, where you just go and take crap from people, which, I guess is good for everybody else. So this created what would become the independent Greek polis, the independent city-states of Greece, because each community would gravitate to somewhere that was good to settle, and then they would isolate themselves. Trade wasn't strong enough to really want to be close to anybody else. Nobody was strong enough to really fight, so they just stayed in their little hill forts, essentially. And they did their best to keep everybody else out. And one of the things in particular that I remember about this was the change in art. Early on, it was like this, where they would cover the entire, say, vase, or what was it another term for it? Infor? They would cover the entire thing in glaze, and they would scrape off the part that they wanted to do the details, so you would see the undercoating. And then it changed to, we'll see a little bit later, where instead they would cover the whole thing in glaze and then scrape the outside off, so it would be, where the outside will be the light part and the inside will be the dark part. It's just something that happened in Greece. Just by the way. All right, so the Iron Age. Mainland Greece was using iron by about 1000 BCE. And hey, people are using iron now, therefore iron is now a commodity that can be used as some kind of economic means. So locating and mining iron was now a thing. However, it wasn't really used for trade. Each polis would jealously protect its own deposit of iron rather than trading it. So when one group discovered iron, they would use it themselves rather than trading it with other places for things that they might need. So it didn't circulate among other polises. If you had iron, good for you, you're the only one that has that iron. Which, I mean, I guess I get to some degree, but yeah, as I've already said, Greeks were very isolationist after the Mycenaean age. Farms only produced enough to sustain themselves. Oh, nice. Or really only enough for individual families, not even for like the whole community. So again, there was no excess grain to trade or whatever. It was just enough to get by. And there are also no large government structures. You and other similar family groups would find a hill and you'd build a fort and you'd keep other people from coming on your hill fort. And if you and another family were to get in a fight, you would probably end up all dead. Because a blood feud means if your cousin Jim Bob killed Joe from another family, then somebody from that family would come kill Jim Bob, and you would have to avenge Jim Bob by killing somebody from the other family, and then somebody from the other family would have to avenge that person by killing you, and then somebody have to avenge you by killing somebody from that family, and then by the end of it, everybody's dead. It doesn't quite work out. This is a very, very far into the future image of the Greeks fighting. So we'll get to that later. Excuse me. I do want to try to get as much into Greece as we can, because it always ends up taking me far longer than I mean for it to. So yeah, as I said, the families would gather together in defensive villages, often atop hills, and they'd wall it off from the outside. This is what I often describe as civilization has fallen, find a hill and throw rocks at anybody that comes near. This happens several times throughout history. Anytime things go especially bad, people leave the cities, find hills, build a fort, and anybody that comes near your hill fort, you throw rocks at. So, time to learn some Greek. This would consist of a hill or high spot known as the Acropolis, acro meaning high and polis meaning city. The market or the agora, which it just means sort of like an open space. Typically, this was run by aristocrats or people who owned the land. So already we're having problems. And only male landholders could be citizens. Once again, we're already having problems, but, European history. On the good side, this Greek isolation and basic lack of an economy, it says economic depression, but they barely had it in the economy at all, meant that while the Assyrians and Phoenicians were tearing each other apart, they didn't even realize Greece was there. Like, there was no Greek presence on the world map. It was just, why bother? I had like 2 or 3 analogies I could have used, and none of them would have made sense to you guys, so we're not going to worry about it. However, as I mentioned, even after Phoenicia was overcome by Assyria and then later Persia, Carthage was still a thing, and it became the new Mediterranean trading power. And it traded with Greece and other Mediterranean regions, and they actually helped to pull Greece out of its economic slump that it had been in since, the end of the Mycenaean Age. So Carthage was very important in just getting them into any kind of economy beyond trading wheat for sheep. What is this other email? All right. Here's a real simplistic polis diagram. So you've got the Acropolis up. Where's my mouse? Okay. You've got the Acropolis up here, the Agora down here. Everything else out here is the hinterlands. So you've still got like little villages where people live, and they're still considered part of the polis, like the polis political structure. Anything inside the wall is the polis physical structure. We'll talk about the polis political structure later. But like anything within this territory is considered like part of the population of the polis. And if they happen to have a port, good for them. They've got a port, and that's also like belongs to the polis. But as far as the like the structure, that's just the 2 parts I want you to know. Is the Acropolis is the part up top, and then the Agora down here in the marketplace. And then we'll talk about like the political structures of the polis a little bit later. But that's why that is all of that. All right. Let's get a little further in, I think, before we can do, let's try to get to the end of this section. All right. This one you should see coming, and it's Homer. He wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. That's probably something you guys should know. Iliad, again, meaning the War of Troy, and Odyssey was just like Odysseus' travels. He probably lived between 850 and 600 BCE. Again, we're not super sure because people didn't really keep records of when people were alive unless they were like kings. Supposedly he was this blind orator. He would just walk around and tell stories, and then eventually people would write them down. His main things were tales of great heroes, especially, well, great heroes of the Mycenaean Age, especially the Trojan War, again, the Iliad. And while this was going on during the Greek Dark Ages, it showed that there was still culture during this era. Even though most of these people were just trying to survive, there was still like this dude going around telling stories and keeping people's spirits up. Granted, most of it was looking back to the good old days of the heroic Mycenaean Age, of when everybody was working together and murdering Trojans. It was still more than just like everybody's doing their best to survive. That said, this is still like some of the only writing we have out of this era, and it wasn't even about this era. It was about the previous era. And I couldn't resist. All right. Here's supposedly Homer being led by, I guess, a kid he'd hired to help him not walk off a cliff, and that dog does not appreciate Homer. I guess what's that kid got a rock in his hand? Yeah, get the dog out of there. There's another illustration of the Trojan horse. Again, doesn't look super accurate because I don't know how many dudes you could fit in that. But I mean, I guess you only really need one to open the gate, right? All right, let's do one more slide and then we'll be done because this is where the section ends and it actually goes really well with Homer. So let's talk about the Greek alphabet. This was adapted from Phoenician writing, which again, if you recall, very important because it actually used letters for sounds. And as I mentioned, Phoenician writing had no vowels. It was just sort of understood that vowels would be in there. The Greek alphabet invented vowels. Great. Literature could actually be read the way it was meant to sound. So this was a major step in the evolution of writing. Is they took Phoenician writing, which was, again, just the consonants, so you could read and kind of understand what was meant to be said, and they excuse me, and the Greeks put vowels in so it would be obvious what was being said, I guess. And yeah, Greek alphabet, just modified Phoenician alphabet, which was modified Linear AB, which I'm not going to go back that far. Phoenician, Greek. And while it didn't catch on immediately, because again, I was actually just thinking this the just yesterday. Like if you look back in time, if you look back in history and say, oh, well, the radio was invented in like, let's say 1898. Well, it didn't catch on until like the 1930s. It wasn't common for everybody to have a radio until like decades later. The Greek alphabet was created over the course of a few decades, but it didn't really catch on until like centuries later. But then it was all over Greece. And it stuck. And I mean, it stuck hard. Our nerdy freaking founding fathers all knew ancient Greek. They wrote to each other in ancient Greek because they were a bunch of freaking nerds. The reason we know Homer's poems is because ancient Greek stuck around as a language that everybody knew. Even if in Greece that wasn't the language they used anymore because they had been taken over by the Muslims, hundreds of years before. But the reason it spread was because, in large part, Homer's Iliad, which the Greeks really liked because for them, they identified with this heroic past, even if they didn't identify with each other. And I was about to get into a 104 tangent, but that can come later. Yeah, like the Athenians and the Corinthians and what are some other ones? I can't say Sparta yet. They didn't exist yet. Eleusinians, they didn't identify with each other, but they all identified with the Mycenaean Greeks. Because back then, they were all Mycenaeans, and they were all, these heroic warriors. So here we have, really old, like Proto-Canaanite language, early Phoenician, and then eventually the Greek. So you can actually see, the early Phoenician actually isn't all that different. Shoot, some of it's just about the same. Now granted, some Greek alphabet letters are things that we don't really quite get. But yeah, Greek letters aren't all that off. And then eventually the Romans take it, and then we have the Italian letters, and that's just basically what we use. Yeah, we'll move on to the next age next week. So I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Sorry, I turned it off. We're not going to be here on Monday, so I will not be recording Monday. So when I don't record Monday, don't send a bunch of emails to me. See you guys on Wednesday.